and going after some of his enemies. I recorded the meeting because I've known Dennis Bonnen a long time, and there have been a number of incidents around the state that just made me very suspicious about where this meeting was going, and just wanted to protect myself, quite frankly.
Mm-hmm.
And turns out that was a good move, and now you've got the state listening to what Dennis Bonnen said behind closed doors and the difference between what he was saying publicly.
The thing. Tell me if I'm off on this, Michael, but one of the things was you had a speaker who said that, like, the verboten sin of any Republican would be to not support any other Republican in their races for the House. And yet in the meeting, he invited you to, through a PAC, to attack certain Republicans to get rid of them, which is just like the most, I can't imagine anything more, sinister or dishonest. Yeah. So tell me, is that true? And number two, if that is true, how in the world can it not be clear that the guy is gone as speaker and they're having a discussion about this?
Well, yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. And in fact, it's in some ways even worse than what you said, Kelly, because first, yes, the House Republican caucus, at Bonnen's insistence, at Speaker Bonnen's insistence, passed a rule saying no member of the caucus can work against another member of the caucus for re-election, or else we'll, call you bad names, or whatever they would do to them. But Bonnen went a step further, and he told media in the state that not only was this a Republican thing, but as Speaker of the House, he would punish, his word, and they could expect retribution, again, his word, any member of the legislature who campaigned against any other member of the legislature, regardless of party.
Yeah, that's Republican and Democrat.
Republican and Democrat. And I think that while I have been more focused on, Mr. Shackelford, you as an attorney can appreciate this. I've been more focused about whatever liability I might have from a potential future bribery schemes and those sorts of things. What the politicians have been asking themselves is, well, gosh, if he lied about that, what else has he lied about? If he's targeting those guys, could he be targeting me next? And I think it has a lot of the members, Republicans and Democrats alike, very frustrated. So I don't know how he survives, except that never underestimate the cowardice of an elected official.
Now, Michael, this week you released the tape, and I believe that's available on your website at empowertexas.com. Is that correct?
Yeah, they can find it at empowertexans.com or texasscorecard.com. They can find it either one of our principal websites.
Right, and a spoiler alert here: this is not for prime time and young ears. So that's
absolutely right. And look, and that's the again, I've been very circumspect about the release of this audio because on the one hand, I recorded it to protect myself. A lot of folks wanted to hear the gossip and the locker room talk and that sort of thing. There's just some inappropriate things said, both from the words your mother told you not to say, but also just kind of inappropriate in terms of just not nice things being said about people by the speaker. So yes, warning, don't listen to this in the car with your kids in the car with you.
So the fallout now, you've released the tape. My understanding is I think Republicans are meeting today, are they not? And one of the topics is, are we going to keep Bonnen as speaker? He's come under fire for this, but I know a number of cynical people who say to me, nothing will change. What are your thoughts on that?
So the Republican caucus had a long-standing retreat scheduled for this weekend in Austin, and this is most definitely going to be among their topics of consideration. Again, I'm fairly cynical when it comes to the moral bravery of politicians. So I can't I won't attempt to forecast what they're going to do. But what I hope it does, set aside the politicians, what I hope this does at a minimum is it gives each one of us as citizens an opportunity to reflect, in our own minds, but also with each other around, what are our expectations for our elected officials? Are we okay with, backroom deal making? Are we okay with quid pro quo relationships? Are we okay with, a vast delta between what politicians say and what they do? No, if we're okay with that, then great. Let's just march on. But maybe we as citizens should think about expecting something more. We should expect our politicians to let their yeses be yeses and their nos be nos. Maybe we should have a discussion among ourselves as the citizens. We're supposed to be in charge. We're supposed to set the tone and the tenor for politics, not sit around as spectators waiting to see, when the next bloodletting will happen.
Well, I'll tell you, if the Republicans go in and reelect, or don't do anything about this, then they're all stained by that, in my opinion. They're affirming that this is the way things happen, that you have this kind of sleazy leadership and you don't do anything about it. I don't know. It speaks very bad. And plus, the one thing that politicians usually are good at is their own self-protection.
Yes.
And
Right.
you can't trust this guy. So I cannot imagine keeping him in the. Is there any talk about if they do get rid of Bonnen? Is there a battle already for who's the next speaker?
That's the question, isn't it, Michael? Because somebody's got to step up and say, "I will run for speaker." And do we have some people out there who are interested in taking that slot? Some good conservatives?
There are several folks who are talking about it. I would suggest to me as a right wing ideologue, hard line, whatever it is, the media likes to call me and others like me, that this is going to sound strange, but I think the first hurdle should not be the next speaker's ideological stances.
Mm-hmm.
It should be on questions of honor and integrity. The role of the Speaker of the Texas House is not to be the dictatorial policy czar of Texas, which is what we've kind of allowed it to morph into. Instead, that person is supposed to make sure the lights are turned on, the air conditioning is set to the right temperature, and that everyone has notepads at their desks. It's a make the trains run on time position with a few add-on responsibilities. And I think first and foremost, John Smithee, the third longest serving member of the Texas House of Representatives, earlier this week put it well when he said that Speaker Bonnen has forfeited his right to continue on in this office, and that there are any number of men and women in that chamber who have the integrity to move forward. And that should be the first question. Now, obviously, you want a conservative. You want someone who holds dear the values of life.
Michael, we're just about to run out of time, but let me thank you for joining us. We've got to go to a hard break here. So thank you so much, and we'll be back in just a minute.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
We're back. This is Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in for Kirby Anderson, and with me in studio, Kelly Shackelford of the First Liberty Institute. And Kelly, we had Michael Quinn Sullivan on from Empower Texans here just a minute ago, and we had to break that off because of the hard break that we were coming up to. But my goodness, what he is shaking up Texas politics there. If you're interested in listening to the tape of his conversation with House Speaker Dennis Bonnen, you can go to empowertexans.com, and the tape is there available. But he held off on that for some months before he finally released it, and he was getting pushed. And he told me a few weeks ago, he said, I kind of hate to release this because there's some things on there that a Christian wouldn't want to necessarily be hearing, and that's the politics that goes on behind closed doors. But my goodness, he is shaking up Texas politics.
It really is fascinating what's happened here. And for those of you who don't know the story, Michael Quinn Sullivan and Empower Texans are known for being, Michael throws a lot of grenades.
Yes, he does.
His job.
Bipartisan grenades.
That's right. His job is fiscal conservatism, and they call the legislators out. And look, in my years of being around this, there are two types of groups out there. There are groups when I say groups that deal with the legislature. There are groups that are all about access, and then there are groups that are all about their principles. And you can't, if you don't know, you might just say, well, this is a pro-life group. Yeah, but is it a pro-life group that's about access, or is it a pro-life group that's about principle? And you really do have to make that decision when you're involved, because you're going to lose access, and you're going to lose, people are going to get upset at you if you stand on your principles. But you've got to make a decision. Well, Michael Quinn Sullivan made a decision long ago. They're about principle. And so even if they make everybody mad, which they do a lot of time, they're gonna stand on fiscal conservatism. And they, along with a number of other groups, this last session, you've got a Republican House, a Republican Senate, a Republican governor, and yet the session was really a letdown for many, many people. And so those groups, like Michael Quinn Sullivan and others, spoke out. The pro-life groups have spoken out, saying, this was bad. This is a bad session. You've got all this control, and you did nothing. And, well, the speaker didn't like that. He said some things publicly about that. And then, so what happened, obviously, is afterwards he thought, well, I better reach out to Michael Quinn Sullivan and see if we can't figure out a way to not have him criticize me anymore. And in the meeting, that's when the shocking of, sort of saying, I'm going to give you a press pass, and I'm going to do all this, and you're not going to criticize me, and hey, by the way, why don't you help me take out some fellow Republicans? And just incredible. I'm shocked that a person that politically savvy would say such things to Michael Quinn Sullivan, who's not known for, just saying, yeah, whatever you say. And again, the thing that's key is that for his own protection. And by the way, there's people listening to this I know outside of Texas. The law in Texas is if you and I are having a conversation, I can tape that conversation. I can't tape two other people's conversation because then that's eavesdropping. That's that's a criminal violation. In some states, in a number of states, I can't tape the conversation between the two of us. So be careful if you're in another state, like if you're in, Maryland or, California or whatever. But in Texas, what he did was perfectly legal. If you're having a conversation with somebody, you don't have to tell them you're taping the conversation. You can tape the conversation. And for him, that was really important because everybody was going to lie about him, and the media wanted to attack Michael Quinn Sullivan, not the speaker. But that tape ended. And again, even there, Michael Quinn Sullivan let people listen to the tape like other legislators so they could see he was being truthful. He didn't want to release it because of some of the things that were on it that were, pretty harsh. And so, but he kept getting pressure from, even I think the lieutenant governor.
And the Democrats were calling for a release of it.
And so he did so, and now it's out there. So if you want to listen to it, you can listen to it. And I'll be shocked if, Speaker Bonnen is still Speaker Bonnen. I just can't imagine how you could let somebody remain a speaker when basically, you don't know when you turn your back if he's going to shoot you or not, because he was clearly trying to shoot a number of his own people in that tape. And so I can't imagine when you would let somebody be in charge when you can't trust them.
Texas is a very conservative state, but it has not had a very conservative speaker for a couple of times.
That's right.
Prior to Dennis Bonnen was Joe Strauss. And Joe Strauss got elected speaker by essentially going to Democrats and saying, if you'll all vote for me, I will, I'll get a few Republicans on board, and then I'll have the Democrats on board, and I'll give you some chairmanships and some other things of that nature. And he was successful in becoming speaker by taking that. Now, my understanding is Republicans have changed that approach in how you elect a speaker, but to me, it seemed like a conservative speaker should be willing to step up. And I actually agree with Michael that the speaker should not necessarily be the ideological driver of the party. And that's why when Newt Gingrich became Speaker of the House, I thought, I think majority leader would probably have been better.
Right.
Somebody who's considered a little more willing to work with the sides and talk, and a little less driven by the ideology would probably be a better person. And that's what it sounds like Michael thinks.
Yes, and I agree with that too. If you know how the Speaker of the House in Texas works, they appoint all the committees, but they don't vote. Their job is, what you really want is a speaker that lets things happen.
Which did not happen with Joe Strauss and to some extent with Bonnen as well.
Yes, Strauss. I remember Strauss told me in person. He said, "Look, I'm maybe not a friend on your issues, but I won't be your enemy." Well, that was a lie, because what he was telling me was that if it was a good, if something came through and the majority of the House wanted it, he would let it go through. But that's not what happened. He would stop those things, and what the Calendars Committee is what they use a lot of times to do that. And that's really, I think, what Michael Sullivan was talking about. You want somebody who's not trying to control everything and be a dictator. You want somebody who has integrity and honesty and will let the process work. And if something is something the people of Texas want, then that should be allowed to be, debated. You should have the vote. It should go through. It shouldn't be somebody strong-arming things behind the curtain. And so I do hope, one of the things we didn't get a chance to ask Michael was, what should people do? My guess is what he would have said is people should call their representatives, because especially if they're Republican, I guess, right now. But even the Democrats are talking about what they're going to do. So really call your representative and say what you want in a speaker, because that decision is essentially being made now, because everybody is trying to figure out, well, what are we going to do? Well,
let me ask you this question. The legislature's out until the beginning of 2021, right?
That's
January
right.
2020. Does the speaker still have the role of speaker? Does the speaker still have some power, or is the speaker somewhat on vacation until then? And do you make that decision now, or do you make it then? And if you make it then, is there time for this to blow over for him?
Yeah, I think you need to make the decision now. As far as what you're going to do, because if you wait for a year and a half, I just think that's not gonna. You're not addressing the issue.
But they wouldn't have another election for the speaker now, since there's no legislature act.
That's right. It's the first vote that the House takes on the floor. So and until the legislature's in session. So I don't know, but there are also there are ways to remove a speaker. So those are all options. And again, I think what will happen is if you have essentially the Republicans saying he's done, then I think you will have more of an agreement where he will step down and those type of things will happen. But I think it would be important, whoever is going to be the speaker needs to be known so that they can be working between now and the future on, the business of the state of Texas. But we'll see. We'll see what's going on. This is certainly, new territory. I don't think I've ever seen anything like this. It kind of reminds you of the Nixon tapes, a little bit. I mean, it's just seeing the underbelly of politics in a really ugly way, and in a way that's really causing some severe repercussions in Texas.
When we come back from the break, Judge Reed O'Connor created some waves a little while back when he ruled that the mandate in Obamacare and then essentially the whole law was null and void.
Yes.
And now Texas Judge Reed O'Connor has come back and weighed in again, and this time on the transgender mandate. So when we come back, we'll look at what Judge O'Connor has said. Stay with us.
A consequential anniversary just passed. It has been 50 years since the nation's first no-fault divorce law was enacted. No-fault divorce laws make it so one partner can end a marriage simply by citing irreconcilable differences. Governor Ronald Reagan signed California's no-fault divorce bill in 1969. 44 states followed suit. Reagan later told his son Michael that this action, which unleashed a revolution, was his greatest regret. The intent of no-fault divorce was to reduce the false accusations that characterized divorce proceedings. To fulfill the legal requirement that a judge find fault in one spouse, the parties would often concoct phony allegations against one another. Sometimes they'd even conspire to lie to a judge. Lawmakers thought it better to lower barriers to divorce than to allow what many called institutionalized perjury to continue. The Daily Signal's Daniel Davis wrote that among the devastating consequences of no-fault divorce is our throwaway culture. He observed that, quote, 50 years later, the perverse incentive to commit perjury seems utterly minuscule when compared with the wreckage that came from the divorce revolution. The divorce rate shot up. Roughly half of children born to married couples in the 1970s saw their parents divorce, up from 11% of those born in the 50s. The rate is lower today, but marriage is also down. The redefinition of marriage has been devastating. It began, Mr. Davis explains, not with same-sex marriage, but with no-fault divorce. No-fault divorce, he writes, essentially made void the contract of marriage. Either party could now break their marriage vows and cite irreconcilable differences to get a divorce. Previously, a transcendent vision of marriage formed the basis of its legal recognition, placing marriage beyond the reach of any human whim. There's something in humans that still craves the transcendence and permanence Daniel Davis describes. There's a solution, he says. It's what the Bible calls covenant faithfulness. We should restore marriage till death do us part. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Merrill Matthews back with Kelly Shackelford. And Kelly, we had an interesting decision this week. You and I have talked a little bit about the health insurance mandate and the fact that the tax law zeroed out the mandate. They left the health insurance mandate in, but they said Congress can't, or they can't penalize you for not having Obamacare qualified health insurance. And so some of the states took that further and said, well, that means Obamacare doesn't apply to us anymore. And Judge Reed O'Connor, Texas judge, agreed with them a little while back and essentially invalidated the law. But then he stayed, I think, so it goes on while this is being appealed. But a lot of us sort of scratched our head and thought, man, that was a broad, sweeping rule on that we weren't entirely sure we were going to get. but we got it. Now he's stepped up again on the issue of transgender rights, and I'm going to read this from Bloomberg News. Christian healthcare professionals don't have to perform transgender-related care that is contrary to their religious beliefs, a federal district court in Texas said, invalidating an Obamacare anti-discrimination rule. The so-called transgender mandate implementing the Affordable Care Act's anti-discrimination provision violates the Administrative Procedure Act and the Religious Freedom Act, the U.S. District Court of the Northern District of Texas said on October 15. Judge Reed O'Connor vacated the rule, which interpreted the ACA's Section 1557 as prohibiting providers and insurers from denying care or coverage based on gender identity or termination of pregnancy. So, Kelly, walk through that a little bit and tell us what this actually means.
Yeah, what you described earlier was, if you'll remember, Obamacare, the big controversy was, did that violate interstate commerce?
Right.
Because it was trying to force people to pay for something.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody thought that's a violation of the Commerce Clause. And for the government to say, you will buy this. Well, John Roberts did some sort of jujitsu
yes, he did.
Where he said, no, this is a tax. It's a tax because you're penalized if you don't do it. Well, everybody was like, no, it's not. But, okay, you didn't want to decide the issue, so that's what we've got now. It's a tax. Well, when the Congress went back and took that penalty away, which they did in the Trump administration, now there's no argument left that it's a tax.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a violation of commerce. So anyway, so that's what they went back to Reed O'Connor to, and they said, well, now that there's no tax anymore, it's unconstitutional. He said, you're right.
Yep.
So that's what he did there. And then what happened here is part of the provisions of Obamacare, because it stayed until the Federal Court of Appeals makes its decision on that. So while
and we're waiting for that decision now, I believe.
We are waiting. It's been argued, and we're waiting. Now what they're arguing about is there are provisions, of course, in Obamacare about what you have to provide for people. One of those is transgender, we're talking about, medical procedures to change sexes and all this.
Mm-hmm.
And religious hospitals, they're like, well, I'm not going to do that. That's against my faith. And, well, I'm sorry, this is what Obamacare says you will do. And so that's why in this case, they came forward. You have a religious plaintiff, and they said, we can't do this. And Judge O'Connor said, you're right. This is a violation of the Constitution. It's also a violation of the Administration Procedures Act. So it's a violation of, I think, the Religious Freedoms Restoration Act, which protects religious freedom. So Judge O'Connor, I know Judge O'Connor. He worked for Senator Cornyn, and he's a great judge because he's just going to do what the law says. And if that means people are going to get upset, that's their problem. But he's done a great job of saying which should be obvious to most people. I mean, do you really think the federal government can force a Catholic hospital to perform sex change surgery that's against their faith? I mean, you can't. So that's essentially what it would be the same as forcing them to do an abortion or anything else.
I was going to ask, do Catholic hospitals, will they not do abortions at the hospital?
I would assume no, So that's what this is about, is whether the Obamacare could force people. Now, again, this is about a specific provision, like, they're interpreting gender identity services and all this.
Right.
But overall, what you mentioned earlier, what Judge O'Connor ruled in the earlier case would mean the entire Obamacare would go down in flames because it would be unconstitutional as a whole. Because, again, the penalty was taken away, therefore it's no longer a tax. And if it's not a tax, then it violates the Commerce Clause by trying to force citizens, to buy things that, they don't want to buy.
And this is, of course, a bigger issue as to whether or not the Civil Rights Act and its restriction of prohibition against people discriminating based upon sex and so forth, the Obama administration said, well, we're going to interpret sex in that, meaning gender and gender identity and other things, and they expanded that significantly to other areas. The Trump administration has tried to claw that back some, but this is sort of a broader agenda of we can't pass the legislation that says this, so let's just reinterpret the law in a way that they would never have been willing to do when they passed the legislation.
And there was just an argument last week at the United States Supreme Court on the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is the law that everybody who has a business with 16 or more employees is not allowed to discriminate in the workplace on the basis of race, sex, religion. Well, what does sex mean? Well, what did it mean? This is 1964. So what did it mean in 1964? I really don't think anybody, is struggling with what it meant. It meant male, female. But now people are trying to read other definitions. Well, it also means sex orientation. Well, it also means gender identity. And, I think what the court is going to say, the Supreme Court, at least the 5 conservatives on the court, are going to say, look, if you want to change what it meant, then that's fine. But don't ask us as courts to reinterpret words when we know very clearly that sex meant male, female in 1964 when this was passed.
When we talk about an originalist judge, we're typically talking about going back to the Constitution as written.
Right.
But does that also mean, does an originalist also say we're going back to a law that was written at some point?
So Absolutely. It's the other word for it is a textualist, right? I mean, they look to the text and they say, what is the original meaning of this text? It's not what do people want it to mean now. I mean, that is not the way. I mean, I don't think anybody wants their contracts interpreted that way.
Yes.
Right? I mean, you get an agreement for somebody, but 20 years later, they come into court and they go, well, it's not really what you meant then and what you wrote then. It's what we want now. Of course, that's what people try to do with the Bible too, right?
Yes.
It's they look at what's there and then they say, well, but in today's, and that's always a recipe for disaster. That is, Merrill, what I think very few people understand the change that occurred on our court. We now, for the first time, maybe since almost 100 years, have 5 justices, a majority, who think their job, and I'm not saying they're always perfect,
right?
But we have 5 justices who think their job is to determine what the original meaning was. Not the living Constitution, not what I think is good for society, not, they actually think their job is to determine what the original meaning was. So if you watch closely, you're seeing in each area of the law things returning back to sort of those constitutional founding principles that are in the documents, because they don't really care what somebody thought in the 1970s. They care more about what the text says and what the original meaning is. And that's unusual. And that's what people don't realize. That's why things are really beginning to change at the Supreme Court and with our case law.
Well, I thank Judge Reed O'Connor for taking that step. So stay with us. We're going to take a break now. And when we come back, we'll be talking a bit about impeachment and national security.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate 2 replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back. This is Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in for Kirby Anderson. And around the table with me today, Kelly Shackelford and Jeremy Dys, both of the First Liberty Institute, out there doing great work on religious liberty and other things. And we'll be talking about that in just a minute. We were talking a lot about what was happening in Texas in the last hour. This hour, we're going to transition to look at some more of the national issues, and especially some national security issues. It's gentlemen, it has been a big week in national and international issues. We got the Brexit deal. Apparently, Brexit's they've got Boris Johnson has got some kind of tentative deal going on with the European Union. You have the Syrian crisis. This is President Trump said we're pulling out of there, and now we've had a week of chaos in Syria. Maybe settling down, though, because Mike Pence went over there and talked to them and said they're pulling back for a week and they're going to hold off on conditioning, and then we'll see what happens there. You've had Trump's letter to the President Erdogan of Turkey, and which I would argue is not normal diplomatic tones when he says, "Don't be a fool."
Yeah.
And then, of course, Venezuela just got voted to be on the Human Rights Council at the United Nations. I don't know how you get Venezuela on the Human Rights Council.
Well, somebody had to fill the seat left by Mugabe. I mean, somebody had to do it.
It's just amazing stuff. But we had a full week of impeachment discussions and things happening in there. The impeachment process is moving on. Nancy Pelosi is sort of backed off a little bit this week on what they're doing with the inquiry, but testimony's been heard. We've had a number of people come forward. We're getting some indication from some of the people who are saying, well, it wasn't the Ukraine thing was maybe a little bit of a pro quo, but maybe not exactly. And Mick Mulvaney, the chief of staff, didn't seem to throw coals on that at first and then water on it later. Where are we on impeachment right now?
Well, I mean, to be honest, we're not in an impeachment inquiry because the Constitution says that the House makes the decisions on impeachment, and there's been no House decision. The Speaker, it doesn't say the Speaker makes a decision on a House inquiry, and that's what we've got. So we've got a weird. This is not, I mean, they're talking about impeachment. This is not an impeachment process. Normal process, if you really do say, hey, you take a vote in the House, you say, all right, we need to start an impeachment inquiry. But there are all kinds of procedural things that we consider just basic due process that are also given because this is somewhat of it's like a criminal proceeding in essence. And so the president, like this is under Nixon, this is under past situations. The House has always said, the president gets his attorney to ask the witnesses, and the people who are testifying questions as well, which is what we would expect. We want to hear all sides. We want to get all perspectives. But not only do they not provide that, they're holding the hearings in secret and then leaking out parts. So I don't know what this is, but it's not an impeachment inquiry. It's just some bizarre attempt by the Democrats who, from day one, have said they want to impeach the president. And so this is some sort of political thing that's going on where you hold secret hearings, you don't allow any due process to the person you're attacking, and then you leak out the parts that you want to leak out. It's really bad, I think. It's a bad process. It's not how we do things in this country. And so it's anybody's guess what's really being said in those meetings because we don't know. We're not getting to see it.
All that said, the House seems to be implying that it wants to try to have something done by Thanksgiving. And Mitch McConnell, because if the House votes to impeach, then it goes to the Senate for the trial. And Mitch McConnell, I think in the last day or so, said, well, we may be doing something around Thanksgiving or there a little after taking this issue up. So it seems to be, whatever it is they have, it seems to be moving forward in some way. Though the other thing is they have just about, I think, like 20 business days left in the House before the end of the year. Now the Speaker can change that and give them and say we're going to stay in for a while, but they don't have a lot of time and they've got a lot of other things to do. Jeremy.
Well, good luck with that. I mean, first thing you got to do is actually, kick off the proceedings and not just threaten, we might do something here or there, or say that they're doing something but not actually following the procedure in order to do it all. So I've got a proposal on the table for every news outlet in the country, and really for anybody that wants to even take me up on this whole thing, whether this is at the dinner table or if you're in Washington, D.C., how about we just stop talking about this until there's actually something to talk about? I mean, just until there's actually a vote until Nancy Pelosi and Adam Schiff and the rest actually put a vote forward to say we're going to now actually formally bring charges. Anything that anybody could be saying right now is mere speculation, and that's a really bad way to run a country. So let's just lay it aside until there's actually something to talk about.
Kelly has talked about this being not constitutional. I've heard people discussing the notion, saying, well, the Constitution doesn't lay much out for how you do this. There's a process that they followed. But it's not necessarily set down in the Constitution. The Constitution's kind of thin on how we do this.
The only thing that is clear is the Constitution says that the one who has the authority to do what it does is the House. Mm-hmm. And the House has not acted. Nancy Pelosi has acted. So whatever's going on now is not impeachment because the Constitution says the impeachment process is controlled by the House. And so there would have to be a vote. They would have to, but they don't want to have a vote because they're worried that there are 20 to 30 Democrats who are in districts that are carried by Trump, and they don't want to expose them if this thing blows up on them. So the only thing that I think is, they might feel like they're getting success because they're getting the polls to move their way a little bit because, again, what they're doing is doing things in secret, leaking only things they think are negative, and then trying to get people to think, well, maybe there's something wrong here. Again, all that's going to fall apart when you bring it into the open. So I'll be shocked, to be honest, if they ever do start doing an actual impeachment and send it to the Senate, because I think it will be shown to be so pathetic that it will backfire on them.
Jeremy, a fairly quick answer. The Trump administration has filed suits on various things that the House has tried to do. If they move forward with this, do they have a case to file a suit to say you're doing this incorrectly and take it to the courts?
Possibly. I suppose anybody can file a lawsuit for pretty much anything these days. So why not throw that one on the fire here as well? But why would the left even have to do something as a body there when the media seems to be carrying the weight for them anyway? They don't actually need to have procedures in place. They don't actually need to have a vote because they're getting plenty enough political play out of it as it is, and that's what the tool is. Kelly's exactly right. This is something that is being designed to help their side of the ledger, while at the same time protecting those who are the most vulnerable from actually having to take an official stand. If you believe so strongly that this president needs to be impeached, and I really truly don't personally have an opinion one way or the other yet. Mm-hmm. But if you do, and if you said that for so long, then put your name on the line and go forward with it all. I think that you owe that to the American people.
Well, we're going to come back in just a minute, and we're going to talk about the National Security Council because national security and foreign policy has been a big issue this week. So joining us in a minute, Dr. John Gans.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Dennis Prager stirred up some controversy by saying something progressives would never let you say. As a Jew, he says that American Jews are the luckiest Jews in Jewish history. He also says that about many other ethnic groups. As I've mentioned in a previous commentary, his father wrote his senior thesis on anti-Semitism in America. Nevertheless, he taught his two sons that they were the luckiest Jews in Jewish history. Dennis Prager still believes that, even though he has written a book about anti-Semitism and taught Jewish history at Brooklyn College. He reminds us that many more Israeli Jews have moved to America than American Jews have moved to Israel. That's not a reflection on Israel, but a reflection on how good it is for Jews to live in America. He then moves on to black Americans. Despite the existence of racism in America, he also makes the case that black Americans are among the luckiest blacks in the world. He even quotes from Keith Richburg, a distinguished black journalist who admits that though his ancestors were brought here on slave ships, he was grateful to be an American when he saw the present-day horrors of Africa. In a moment of candor, he revealed, "I thank God my ancestor made that voyage." What about people from Latin America? Dennis Prager comes to the same conclusion. They are among the luckiest Latinos in the world. How could they or anyone else deny the fact that millions of Latin Americans have been willing to leave their family, their friends, their culture, and their language to come to America? And we know that there are tens of millions more who desire to do the same. Of course, there are many in this country that claim America is the source of evil. They claim that racism and bigotry are alive. They ignore the good of America and focus only on what is wrong. But they may not admit it, but they also are some of the luckiest people in the world. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And Merrill Matthews back with Kelly Shackelford and Jeremy Dys as we're talking about national security issues. I think we're going to have Dr. John Gans on the line in just a minute to talk about the National Security Council. But we've had this issue of national security. President Trump has decided to sort of announced rather quickly that he wanted to pull out of Syria, pull our troops out. I don't think we had a lot of troops in there because he just said, we don't want to be in these endless wars. And I think there's probably a lot of sympathy for that. We've been in Iraq for a long time. We're basically out of that, but we've also been in Afghanistan. That's become our longest war, and this has become a real problem. Dr. Gans, are you with us now?
Absolutely. How are you?
I'm well. You're here with Kelly Shackelford and Jeremy Dys of the First Liberty Institute. Thank you so much for joining us. Well, let me just give people a quick background of you. You're a PhD. You're the Director of Communications and Research at Perry Worldhouse, at the University of Pennsylvania's Global Policy Institute, and a fellow at the German Marshall Fund. Now, I noticed that back in the summer, I believe it was, you were at the Center for Strategic and International Studies talking a bit about the National Security Council. National security is playing a big role right now, and especially the NSC. Give us a little bit of background. What is the National Security Council? What role does it play, and how has it evolved over the past, 60 years or so?
70 years, yeah.
70 years,
No,
yeah.
it's so good to be with you, and obviously, I think there's a lot of people trying to figure out what the NSC is and what they're up to today, and it starts with understanding a little bit how they sort of came to be, which was the National Security Council was really created in reaction to World War II. How Franklin Roosevelt won World War II sort of drove everybody in Washington crazy, right? He sort of tried to run that war by the seat of his pants. He called it juggling, which was that he basically gave orders, and sort of sometimes they contradicted each other. Sometimes he gave the same orders to everybody and told and sort of stoked a competition to see who finished them first.
That sounds vaguely familiar.
Yeah, well, and most of Washington sort of came out of this really frustrated, right? They were kind of sitting there scared. It was a two-front war. The U.S. government was getting much bigger during World War II. I always like to remind people I served in the Pentagon for a few years, and the Pentagon was built during World War II, right? So the buildings, the people, the size of government grew dramatically in the war. And so big war, global war, big government, and people said this is no way to run it. And you have an elderly man who had some health problems trying to run this war single-handedly from the White House. And so after Roosevelt died and the war was won, there was sort of an agreement that we needed to get the president some help, so he didn't have to run the country, run America's foreign policy by himself. And so they created a National Security Council, and that was basically an idea to say, okay, we want everybody to be talking and these issues to be looked at from all the different angles. And so what happened was they basically wanted to get everybody in a room. So they said, let's get the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, some of the Treasury secretaries and others in the room with the president, the vice president, and say, okay, just talk it out. That was basically what the idea was, put them all in a room. And as part of that, they said, if you're going to get all these big names in a room, you need somebody to make sure they show up on time, somebody to make sure they're talking to an agenda, and somebody to make sure that we know what they decide. And so they created a little staff that was really there to help push the papers. And they went about creating a National Security Council staff. And from that little staff has grown a 300 or 400 person institution in the heart of government that's run by the National Security Advisor and who reports to Donald Trump alone and is subject to no congressional investigations, congressional confirmation. And it really changed how America runs its government and how it's fought its wars. And so I wrote a book called White House Warriors that looks at these staffers and the National Security Advisors and sees and looks at what they've done to help change how we make decisions as a country.
You know, when you start something like this, when you start a new agency, bureau, or whatever, they oftentimes grow significantly. As you mentioned, the National Security Council has grown. Sometimes these things grow so large that they sort of start stepping on each other and they undermine their own effectiveness. Is the National Security Council about right? Has it grown too large? Is it still effective? How is it working now?
Well, I think, the two things I'd say about it is that usually when you start an agency, it's done on more than one line of law. And so the National Security Council and the staff that's grown from it was really just one line of law in a giant law called the National Security Act of 1947. And so there's been very little actual of the things that you go into creating an agency. It's almost an accidental agency, right? The National Security Advisor didn't even exist when they created the job. That was a job that basically was created by the president on top of the National Security Council staff and sort of glommed onto the National Security Council itself. So it's a very weird way to start an agency to begin with. It has grown dramatically larger than anybody would have expected. Now, the current National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, published a piece earlier this week on sort of what he called downsizing the NSC staff, making it smaller. Mm-hmm. But broadly speaking, you're talking, he says it's basically like almost 180 policy advisors and then about 110, 120 so staffers who sort of help run the technology and things along those lines. So you're talking 300 or so people who do this. So there's very little sort of legal foundation for these people. The second thing is that you run into is that most of the time, Congress has sort of looked the other way because, broadly speaking, we tend to let presidents do what they want to do in Washington. But the second thing is that it's largely met Congress's original intent, which was integrating and making sure all the hard questions were asked and making sure everybody was sort of comparing notes and saying, okay, how do we handle these issues? And the staff and the National Security Advisors have largely helped fill that role, which is get everybody talking and making sure everybody's on the same page. The challenge you've run into today is that that President Trump was new to government when he came in, has struggled to sort of make this work for him, and has, based on news reports, sort of downsized the size of the staff, but also sort of made the process much less robust and, to a degree, much less controlling of his own behavior. And what you sort of have now is another president sort of running national security by the seat of his pants, which is kind of a challenge. You know, you don't have to compare Franklin Roosevelt to Donald Trump to sort of feel worried. America is much bigger. Its interests are much more global. And to a degree, many more people are counting on America's decisions than they were in 1945.
I have seen stories in the past, this is prior to Donald Trump coming in, where the Secretary of State would make recommendations, the National Security Advisor makes recommendations, I think some others, Director of National Intelligence and others, but that sometimes the president is sort of setting the Secretary of State aside and moving more with the National Security Advisor. I assume at times it may be just the opposite. Are there clashes between those various agencies that are all trying to get the president's ear on national security?
Yeah, I mean, I think that broadly speaking, that I think there's an appreciation for the fact that because government is full of human beings, it's full of all the challenges and pathologies that come with human enterprises, right? So there's competition, there's politics, there's misbehavior, there's all those sorts of things. So the first thing you have to remember is these are human beings just like you and me, and the boss and the workplace and the office is a lot like your office, my office, everybody's office, right? There's days where you hate the boss. There's days where you love the boss. There's days where you love working with your colleagues. There's days when you can't drive them crazy. There's bad ones. There's good ones. And so there's been naturally disagreements, right? Like these are passionate people talking about very high stakes issues. And so there's disagreements. There's natural tensions between diplomacy and military force, right? Like there's a natural tension that comes between those people who think we need to use our military more and those that think we need to talk more. And then there are occasionally like real bad sort of personality conflicts. The sort of classic examples are Nixon and sort of his shenanigans with Henry Kissinger to basically freeze out the Secretary of State. There's the classic clash in Washington is the fights between Caspar Weinberger, who was Secretary of Defense under Ronald Reagan, and George Shultz, who was Secretary of State. They had like a lifelong beef with each other that Reagan kind of ignored when he made Shultz Secretary of State, and led to just fights forever. Like they fought over everything just as a matter of because they'd been fighting about everything for their entire lives. And so you run into one of these things where occasionally you have those things, and then you have the other type of problem, which is when real trust just collapses in the National Security Council. And so you see this very often when things kind of go bad or sideways, right? So the Iraq War and the sort of misdecisions and indecisions and bad decisions that were part of the Iraq War really from before it started sort of led to trust just collapsing among the principals, like people like President Bush.
Dr. Gans, hold that thought. We're going to take a break here, and we'll be back with Dr. John Gans, the Director of Communications and Research at Perry Worldhouse at the University of Pennsylvania's Global Policy Institute. So stay with us, and we'll be back.
There's an old saying that the first casualty in war is truth. Maybe that helps you understand what's happening in America right now. Thankfully, it's not a war with bullets, but there is a war for control. Control of the country and control of your pocketbook. Truth is under fire, but you can help turn the tide by supporting Truth. Join the Truth Team at Point of View Radio. Learn how you can make a difference at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Don't let truth become a casualty on your watch. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
So what would you do with an extra $500 a month in your budget? Pay off loans, save it, do something fun? Well, it's something you may need to think about if you become a member of MediShare. MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. You can save big time on your healthcare costs, and you don't have to pay for things you don't believe in either. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40. 855-SHARE-40.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
And we're back. Merrill Matthews in for Kirby Anderson, and with us on the phone, Dr. John Gans. He's the Director of Communications and Research at Perry World House, which is the University of Pennsylvania's Global Policy Institute. And Dr. Gans, Kelly Shackelford has a question for you.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things, I know you mentioned FDR and kind of, just going his own way and not having all this. It reminded me a little bit. I remember when I read the biography on Einstein. One of the reasons why he discovered the theory of relativity is because, and it's the first time I really realized this, is talked about how people who are very creative are typically somewhat anti-authority because they just don't accept everything that everybody else accepts. Mm-hmm. And so Trump's got a little of that in him, obviously. And I wonder, because everybody's always just assumed that this situation in Syria that, well, we support the Kurds, we do what we've always done. And obviously he has a different perspective, and he kind of ran on that a little bit. And so help us think through, because, I'm like sitting here going, well, I've never really thought about this. Why, do we need to be over there? Yes, we've now given control where now the Kurds are talking to the Russians, and that sounds really bad. We've lost a friend. Right? And
Syria.
Yeah, but do we want to be in the middle of all of that? What is the upside, downside? Is rethinking some of this, some people are maybe thinking about it the first time. So I'd love to hear your perspective on why, what are the arguments, and why are people concerned, and why does some people think maybe this is a good move?
Well, I think there's two things to sort of think about here. The first is there is a fair and, to a degree, necessary debate about America's involvement in Syria, probably the broader area there with, Iraq, Turkey, and things along those lines, and to a degree, the broader Middle East. And that is a debate that has been playing out for, I would say, probably, really sort of started in earnest with the Iraq War. I think most Americans have largely, supported the Afghanistan War, probably much longer than most would have predicted, given how long it's gone on. But the Iraq War really sort of crystallized our involvement and sort of made an issue our involvement on the ground and in the broader Middle East. And so I think there is an honest debate about that, and I think that that's something that the Obama administration probably could have done a better job of sort of discussing why they put some troops there but not a ton of troops there, why the Kurds were such a big piece of our strategy there, because they basically were doing a lot of the fighting and we were doing a lot of the advising, and that allowed us to accomplish our goals against the counter-ISIL in the counter-ISIL campaign, the effort to sort of defeat the sort of Islamic State, but without taking as many sort of on-the-ground risks. And so I think to a degree, there's a piece of that that's natural and right and to a degree necessary. And Donald Trump, I think, has had a pretty resounding opinion about that since before he took office, and one that probably was popular with certain people, which is that we need to get out, right? That this is not worth the risk. And I think he's played, probably a little less as aggressive in terms of the broader Middle East, but was pretty specific about Syria from the beginning, right? From before he even ran for office. I think so there's a serious debate there, and a serious debate about the commitments we've made to the Kurds and others. But then there's the question of how, even if you agree with the decision to sort of remove ourselves from that area, there's the how you do it. And I don't think anybody, even the people who have been advocating for this for years, would argue that the messy way we've done it, which has opened us up to a lot more risk and those on the ground to a lot more bloodshed than is probably necessary, just because of how quick this was done, how poorly thought through this was done, right? This is the thing that everybody worried about with Roosevelt and worries about with everybody else, which is, there's sometimes when you're running foreign policy by the seat of the pants, you're going to get some stuff right sometimes, right? Like, Franklin Roosevelt helped win World War II, right? But it's very hard to count on that. And national security is probably too important to be left to just making these decisions on the fly and not being thought through. And there's a piece where conversations stifle creativity, but there's also a piece where conversations help minimize the risks that come with those things. And I think that what we see here is, as necessary and important as the conversation about America's involvement in Syria may be, Donald Trump really hasn't demonstrated the capacity to force government to have that conversation or come up with a better policy. Because I think what has happened is for the past 3 years, he's taken a sort of oppositional stance to his own government and said, it's my way or the highway. And to a degree, government's done the same thing. And so rather than come to some compromise or even some better idea or more creative idea that comes from sort of, working together and brainstorming, you've just had this low-running conflict over Syria, right? Jim Mattis resigned over Syria. Others have resigned over Syria. And what you have is that instead of thinking things through, you've actually just had this catastrophe. And, I don't think even if you were opposed to America's involvement in Syria, you would want it to be catastrophic about getting out of it. I think that's the challenge that everybody's sort of feeling here, which is, there's plenty of people who support his decision to get out of Syria or move away from America's deep engagement in Syria, but there's nobody who would recommend this as the process to get there.
Doctor, what are the implications, do you think, for Israel in the things that are going on in Syria?
Well, I saw Prime Minister Netanyahu said a few things, I guess, last night or this morning, sort of saying, like, we just want this to not be, to not be as dangerous or necessary or sort of bloody as it's been. I mean, I think, this will sort of rejigger the regional dynamics in some ways, and to a degree, I think that's why the way it's been done is so risky, in part because there's a lot of people whose interests are involved here, whether it's Iran, Russia, Turkey, Israel, Syria, and only some of them are friendly with Israel. And so I was assuming that Israel is very worried about sort of anarchy or real disarray here, because that tends to aid and abet those people, and has historically aided and abetted those people who have, who make Israel sort of an opponent or a target of their actions.
When the civil war broke out in Syria, I thought Bashar al-Assad, who runs Syria, that his days were probably going to be numbered. Turns out he's been a survivor in this.
Yeah, well, a lot of people did, right? I mean, I think even Barack Obama said his days are numbered, right? I mean, I think there were a lot of people who looked at it and thought, hey, he's not going to make it. But I think the one challenge you find is that, and his father was the same way. Like, if you're willing to be brutal enough, you can hold on. But, I mean, Syria isn't the country it once was. I mean, I think, millions of refugees and hundreds of thousands who are dead, and it's not the same place. And to a degree, he's had to make a series of deals to stay in power. So I think that this is one of those stories and one of those ongoing tragedies that really has had just global ramifications. I mean, if you just look at the refugee totals alone and what those refugees have spawned in countries across Europe and across the Middle East, right? They've created they've changed the politics of those countries in specific ways, which is kind of staggering. I mean, if you look at what happened in Germany, what happened in countries that have sort of had this reaction, and even to a degree, some of the anti-refugee sentiment that we sort of experienced in the United States, like this has been a global changing event, and it's one that's still happening. And I think, it is very easy to say the United States should just get X, like either go in with all its troops or get out and never look at it. But it's one of those nasty problems that unfortunately, has been going on for almost a decade now. Nobody's come up with a better solution. And yet the events and the sort of effects of it keep sort of spiraling out of control. So I think it's, it's not an easy problem, and it's a problem that probably could require all the best and brightest and every smart person in the world thinking about it. And yet we're sort of in a place where, it's hard to get a meeting in Washington with those people. I mean, you saw the meeting between Donald Trump and congressional Democrats sort of spiral into a breakdown over Syria, right? Like there's nobody who's able to have a good conversation, in part because government has broken down in pretty specific ways in Washington.
Well, Dr. Gans, thank you so much for joining us. Again, the name of the book, White House Warriors, where he looks at the NSC, the National Security Council, and its impact and some of the people who have been involved in that. So thank you for your insights, and thank you for joining us, sir.
Thank you very much. Look forward to talking to you.
Well, that was interesting about an issue that none of us seem to have a very good answer on. Gentlemen, when we come back, I'm excited about this next segment. William Barr, the Attorney General, went to Notre Dame and gave a speech on religious liberty, and he upset some people with that.
It's an incredible speech. If people hadn't read it, I know we have it at pointofview.net where they can read it themselves.
Indeed. So when we come back, we're going to look at what Attorney General Barr said and the implications for religious liberty. So stay with us, and we'll be back in just a minute.
A consequential anniversary just passed. It has been 50 years since the nation's first no-fault divorce law was enacted. No-fault divorce laws make it so one partner can end a marriage simply by citing irreconcilable differences. Governor Ronald Reagan signed California's no-fault divorce bill in 1969. 44 states followed suit. Reagan later told his son Michael that this action, which unleashed a revolution, was his greatest regret. The intent of no-fault divorce was to reduce the false accusations that characterized divorce proceedings. To fulfill the legal requirement that a judge find fault in one spouse, the parties would often concoct phony allegations against one another. Sometimes they'd even conspire to lie to a judge. Lawmakers thought it better to lower barriers to divorce than to allow what many called institutionalized perjury to continue. The Daily Signal's Daniel Davis wrote that among the devastating consequences of no-fault divorce is our throwaway culture. He observed that, quote, 50 years later, the perverse incentive to commit perjury seems utterly minuscule when compared with the wreckage that came from the divorce revolution. The divorce rate shot up. Roughly half of children born to married couples in the 1970s saw their parents divorce, up from 11% of those born in the 50s. The rate is lower today, but marriage is also down. The redefinition of marriage has been devastating. It began, Mr. Davis explains, not with same-sex marriage, but with no-fault divorce. No-fault divorce, he writes, essentially made void the contract of marriage. Either party could now break their marriage vows and cite irreconcilable differences to get a divorce. Previously, a transcendent vision of marriage formed the basis of its legal recognition, placing marriage beyond the reach of any human whim. There's something in humans that still craves the transcendence and permanence Daniel Davis describes. There's a solution, he says. It's what the Bible calls covenant faithfulness. We should restore marriage till death do us part. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we're back. Merrill Matthews, and with me in studio, Kelly Shackelford and Jeremy Dys from the First Liberty Institute. And this segment, we're going to talk a little bit about Attorney General William Barr, who gave a speech at the law school at Notre Dame Friday last week. And made some very interesting comments on the issue of religious liberty. I'll read here just real quick one small segment. From the founding era onward, there was strong consensus about the centrality of religious liberty in the United States. The imperative of protecting religious freedom was not just a nod in the direction of piety. It reflects the framers' belief that religion was indispensable to sustaining our free system of government. Religion was indispensable to sustaining our free system of government. The Attorney General drew some raised eyebrows from that speech because he was so forceful on the issue of religious liberty, and yet he's just trying to take us back to where the country has historically been. Is that fair, Kelly?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know how many of the listeners have read his speech, but if you haven't, I cannot recommend really anything more than reading his speech. I mean, you got time this weekend. It's
not that long, and
it's one of the best speeches I've ever read. I mean, it's just really, really excellent. It's not only does it flow well, but it uses quotes from our founders. It sort of ties together concepts. It sort of helps you understand what's necessary. So many people are upset about our culture, kind of spiraling out of control, and this explains how things work, and then also, as you mentioned, for an attorney general to say what he said takes a lot of courage. I don't know if it's courage, because my everything I've known from the attorney general is he doesn't care. He doesn't really care what you think, because it's more important that he do what he thinks is right. And so he knows this is true. He was at Notre Dame. For people who criticize him, I'm like, oh, good grief. He's speaking to Notre Dame, and he's talking about religious liberty and giving the foundations. So, but I would just really encourage people. It's at pointofview.net. They can go there and look at it.
And the link there is actually the Justice Department's website, so it's up on the Justice Department's website.
It's an incredible speech, really is.
When you read it, here's the criticism that he's receiving the most here. There are a couple ones here. Jeffrey Toobin from writing in the New Yorker said that it's the worst speech by an Attorney General of the United States in modern history. So, I mean, you and Toobin are going to have some falling out there, Kelly. Catherine Bramble, writing in the Washington Post, said it was a tacit endorsement of theocracy. And then Paul Krugman wrote in the New York Times, probably had the longest and most eviscerating comments about the speech itself. He said that Barr sounded remarkably like America's most unhinged religious zealots who commit mass murder because schools teach the theory of evolution. Evidently, he believes that there are gangs of anti-evolutionists roaming the country chanting the mantra, and this is the mantra that Krugman wrote: guns don't kill people, Darwin kills people. And Barr apparently is at the lead of all that. So that's the criticism. And on top of all that, they're basically saying as well that the person who gave it was wrong, because what he is saying here is that religion is better than secularism, and therefore he is not representative of the neutrality that's required of an American public servant. And in fact, he's going beyond that. He's denigrating those who have no religious belief whatsoever. Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of things to be said about that. And I think first off on all of it is that the left has so forgotten what neutrality looks like that they believe that that neutrality is actually government-enforced secularism.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what Barr was trying to wage against. In fact, he said in his speech, if I can find the quote there again, he said that militant secularists today do not have a live and let live spirit. Well, that lands heavy on people who thinks that the government's job is to enforce secularism. Well, that's not the government's job. The government's job is to get out of the way altogether and allow neutrality truly to be in existence on these things, to allow that live and let live mentality. He said elsewhere in the speech that there was that this effort by secularists to this unrelenting assault on religion and traditional values has become a religion in and of itself, including inquisitions and excommunication, he says. And while they're not, being led to the stake or anything like that right now, we certainly have seen evidence all over the place of people losing their jobs, of being called a bigot, and all these things because they held a religious belief, and the government didn't want to allow that to stand anyway. So Barr's speech is a really helpful correction to the idea that a religion is a bad thing in public. And if you need any evidence for why that is, then just look again at his critics. The fact that William Barr himself, not only the Attorney General of the United States, but a longtime practicing Catholic, appears at a Catholic university, and it says something that is in agreement with Catholicism and gets lambasted for daring to bring his religion into the public square should be all the evidence you need to indicate that the left is not about this toleration of some sort of neutrality that is necessary for government to allow people to be free, but they're upset by the fact that the guy who is in the attorney general's seat is not kowtowing to their idea that you must, as the government official in charge, enforce and require people to abandon their religious belief in public and reassert that, insert instead of that religious belief an avowed agreement with secularism itself. That's not neutrality.
And it's almost used as religion is perceived as malicious in the sense that you're discriminating against transgender or other people, and you're doing it under the guise of your religious freedom. So you're using your religious liberty in order to be able to go out and discriminate. And so that's why you have to stop that.
Precisely, and that's why Barr says this in the speech. The problem is not that religion is being forced on others. In other words, it's not that we're having so many people come out and say, you must believe in this religion, or even that the government's coming out and saying, you must go to this church or whatever. So the problem is not that religion is being forced on others. He says the problem is that irreligion and secular values are being forced on people of faith. And that's where you have the real predicament, where you have, to just borrow from a most recent administration, you have an entire United States of American legal apparatus going after celibate nuns and requiring them to buy birth control. That is enforcing your religion as a government, your ideology upon people of faith. That's not neutrality. That is active hostility towards religion. And Barr is right to call this out. And I really hope that other agencies are paying attention, because not only is there the deep state that is actively working against the administration here in terms of religious liberty and a lot of other fronts, but I believe that there are some secretaries that are even being duped by some of that deep stateism that's in there. They're being convinced of this secularism as neutrality that does not exist under our Constitution.
Yeah, look, here's the two. I just did a quick search for what comes out under Barr's speech. The first two are William Barr's wild misreading of the First Amendment. The second one is Notre Dame had a right to host Barr, but his talk was ridiculously stupid, and on, right? So he's hit the mark because there's some secularists that are very upset. Look, the summary of what he said was, our country only works for people with virtue. And in order to have people with virtue, you have to have religion, because otherwise you're God. And so if there's not something higher than you that you're responsible to, it's not going to work. Now, that's not his opinion. That's our founder's opinion. And for him to say that and lay it out in such a way that he did, I thought was excellent. But it's amazing how many people don't like the founding of this country and what it's all about. They need to go back and criticize the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, because that's what they really have a problem with.
And, of course, First Liberty's been at the forefront of the religious liberty issue. And when we come back, we want to touch base on some of the things that y'all have been doing recently and some of the issues that are out there, because Barr may have ruffled some feathers, but there's a lot of feathers being flown around here.
Absolutely.
So stay with us. We'll come back in just a minute.
So when people first hear about Medi-Share, they have questions. Some good ones, like, what is it? Well, Medi-Share is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry. It's not health insurance. It's a different way of doing things, which leads us to this question. Why do so many become Medi-Share members? Two big reasons. They save a lot. The typical family saves $500 a month, and they feel great about it. With Medi-Share, you aren't forced to pay for things you don't believe in. Find out more. 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40.
It seems we can't get through a day without hearing how science has been corrupted to support political goals. Media entities have sold out truth for the sake of favored narratives. Even some religious groups have abandoned the Bible to support things based on feelings. So who can you trust? Kirby Anderson and the Point of View Truth Team are your source for real news. Learn how you can make a difference by joining the team at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. In a world of unending fog, Point of View is a shining light. Do your part at pointofview.net/team or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, thank you for joining us for our last hour of Weekend Review. In the last hour, we were talking with Attorney General William Barr, talking of him and a speech he gave at Notre Dame Law School on religious liberty. So this is Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation. In studio with me today, Kelly Shackelford and Jeremy Dys from First Liberty Institute. And when we're talking about religious liberty, which is what William Barr was doing at Notre Dame Friday last week, that is right in your wheelhouse, Kelly and Jeremy. That is what you do. So the Supreme Court, talking about this past week, has been looking at the issue of religious liberty. What do we know about that?
Well, they start back in the first Monday in October. That's kind of when the Supreme Court always starts back into session. And so, looking at the term, you have to ask yourself, what does this term look like? Well, we don't know completely yet because they could take some more cases. Mm-hmm. Last term, I would remind people, we had the really significant victory in the Bladensburg Cross case. And that, of course, was the Veterans Memorial that was put up almost 100 years ago by mothers who lost their sons in World War I. Right. And the Court of Appeal said tear it down because it's a violation of the Establishment Clause. Well, it's obviously not, some sort of government, established church issue. So where does that come from? It comes from a case called Lemon. It's a really bad case that has been used to attack religious freedom for 50 years. Mm-hmm. In that case, they really they demolished Lemon, and that's what we asked them to do. Said Lemon is just no good. It's not what the Constitution says. So that is a huge historic shift that we just went through from a sort of hostility to religion for 50 years to now a new direction. And so the question is, what is this term? Is it going to add to that?
And by new direction, it almost means just moving back to neutral, right?
That's exactly right. One that is pro-religious freedom. That is not where the government's supposed to be the enemy of religious freedom. Some of the founders would have been appalled by. So that's a huge change for good. And so the question is, are we going to continue? I think we are. And the cases that come to mind immediately are the case that was just argued last week, actually the three cases that involved how you interpret a federal law that says you can't discriminate on the basis of sex in the workplace and what that means. Well, in 1964, when they passed the law, I don't think there's any mystery as to what sex meant. It meant male, female. Now they're trying to say, well, it means all these other things now, gender identity and sexual orientation. I think the court's going to come back. We'll see. But I would have to guess that you've got the five conservatives who actually look at the original meaning. They're going to come back and say, look, if you want to change the statute, you can. But in 1964, it meant male, female. That has implications on religious groups because if you're a religious organization, and all of a sudden you're not allowed to discriminate on the basis of sex, and that means, transgenderism and all these other things, you're going to get into all kinds of religious liberty battles that are going to occur. This will stave off many of those, depending on how they interpret it. Another big case is Espinoza. This is a case out of Montana where essentially they have a program where you can contribute to scholarship funds for private education, and you get a deduction for that, unless the private education is religious. So if you're a private school, you're treated the same unless you're a religious school, and then you're discriminated against. And that's going to bring up what's called these Blaine amendments, which are provisions in many state constitutions that have a really horrible anti-Catholic bigotry history that I think are on their way out. Whether this case will be the case to do that or not, I do think the odds are that this case will say, look, this is discrimination against religious schools versus other private schools, and the government can't do that. So that could be a big case that starts to move us in more towards religious freedom than we had. And then we have a case we're waiting to hear from right now that'll be a very big case on, it's the Roman Catholic Diocese of San Juan. And this, Puerto Rico, this will be a really big case on sort of the right of religious groups like churches to decide for themselves what their structures are and who they are. This is a real attack on that very core freedom that every church has to decide who they are, what their structure is. So those are just a few of the cases, and I think we're going to see a real continuing of, I think every American's about to have more religious freedom than they've ever had, because I think what we have now, when you look at Bladensburg, we've got justices who think their job is to look to the original meaning. And when you look at the religion clauses, we've strayed away from the original meaning, and we've got a lot of bad cases that are going to start to be cleaned out as the justices, especially the 5 in the majority, look to what was the original meaning of the founders for these religion clauses. I think we're going to see a vibrancy of religious freedom really restored.
Speaking of cases, and we mentioned this in the first hour, Bloomberg reported earlier this week, their headline, Obamacare transgender bias rule violates religious freedom law. And this is a ruling from Texas Judge Reed O'Connor, who also weighed in on the mandate on Obamacare. But the story reads, Christian healthcare professionals don't have to perform transgender-related care that is contrary to their religious beliefs, a federal district court in Texas said, invalidating an Obamacare anti-discrimination rule. So you're talking about some of these things coming up, but whether or not healthcare professionals have to provide certain services to transgender people, Judge O'Connor has said, no, you're not. Obamacare tried to say you absolutely had to do it. Judge O'Connor's trying to pull that back.
Yeah, and that's very important. I mean, look, I don't want to be grotesque when we're talking about this, but let's be very clear about what was being required of these medical practitioners. It was very much less than just giving out a pill or something like that, although I suppose that was involved in certain chemical castration elements of that. But there were physical requirements involved here as well. So doctors who believed that at least part of one's gender is determined by not only by their their chromosomal levels, but also by their actual genitalia, were being asked to remove those things or to alter them in some way. They were being asked to play the part of the creator who originally put those parts together in their proper order. That's what the government was asking these doctors to, not asking them to do. That was what the government was telling them that they were required to do, that they were actually required to wield the scalpel to remodify, not in a plastic surgery kind of a way, but to remodify a human body to comport with something that is against their theological position or their conscience idea of what a man or a woman actually is. When you think about it that way, I think we can better understand why it would be that someone would have an objection on their conscience about it. It's not just an icky thing to do. There's an actual, I'm taking the place of the one who knit this body together inside of his or her mother's womb and saying that I know better how to create this body than that deity did. And that's something that the government ought to be very loath in mandating occur.
It's an amazing development, and we'll see where this goes. When we come back, we're going to talk about another case that I think you're working on in Idaho, because when you're talking about religious liberty, the issue of Christmas comes up.
It does.
We've been having those struggles now for years. So ask you to stay with us. We're going to come back in just a minute and talk a little bit more about the religious liberty and the challenges to it when we come back.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Dennis Prager stirred up some controversy by saying something progressives would never let you say. As a Jew, he says that American Jews are the luckiest Jews in Jewish history. He also says that about many other ethnic groups. As I've mentioned in a previous commentary, his father wrote his senior thesis on anti-Semitism in America. Nevertheless, he taught his two sons that they were the luckiest Jews in Jewish history. Dennis Prager still believes that, even though he has written a book about anti-Semitism and taught Jewish history at Brooklyn College. He reminds us that many more Israeli Jews have moved to America than American Jews have moved to Israel. That's not a reflection on Israel, but a reflection on how good it is for Jews to live in America. He then moves on to black Americans. Despite the existence of racism in America, he also makes the case that black Americans are among the luckiest blacks in the world. He even quotes from Keith Richburg, a distinguished black journalist who admits that though his ancestors were brought here on slave ships, he was grateful to be an American when he saw the present-day horrors of Africa. In a moment of candor, he revealed, "I thank God my ancestor made that voyage." What about people from Latin America? Dennis Prager comes to the same conclusion. They are among the luckiest Latinos in the world. How could they or anyone else deny the fact that millions of Latin Americans have been willing to leave their family, their friends, their culture, and their language to come to America? And we know that there are tens of millions more who desire to do the same. Of course, there are many in this country that claim America is the source of evil. They claim that racism and bigotry are alive. They ignore the good of America and focus only on what is wrong. But they may not admit it, but they also are some of the luckiest people in the world. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we're back. Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson, and with me is Kelly Shackelford and Jeremy Dys from the Religious Liberty Institute. 1-800-351-1212. 1-800-351-1212 if you'd like to call in and weigh in on the issue of religious liberty, on the impeachment debacle going on right now, or our policy in Syria, or anything else that's happening this week. So 1-800-351-1212. Now, Jeremy, y'all are, First Liberty's also engaged in a issue in Idaho, as I understand, has to do with Christmas. What's going on there?
Yeah, we just filed an appeal here. I guess it was late last Friday night, as a matter of fact. It was very, very late last Friday night that we filed that appeal at the Ninth Circuit. So, I mean, people kind of understand the Ninth Circuit is a different territory to enter into. Well, up in the state of Idaho is a family who live inside of a homeowners association. This is kind of out in the country. It's a very woody homeowners association. So if you're in the Dallas area, it doesn't look like your homeowners association. It's a lot different looking than this one is. And it's maybe 50 houses in this HOA. Well, I have a general bias against HOAs myself, and maybe some of you do as well. But here's what happened. Jeremy and Christy Morris, they really, really like to decorate for Christmas. And like, they make Clark Griswold look like an amateur.
Yeah.
I mean, I think 4 inches of the house has a light on it. They've got stuff out on the lawn and stuff. They even brought in a camel as a part of the live nativity.
A live camel?
A live, real, honest to goodness, spitting kind of camel. And so this became sort of a thing. And when they moved into this HOA, they actually inquired of the board to say, look, we've reviewed your covenants and restrictions, and they seem to indicate that there's no problem here. And so we plan to do this. Just want to give you a heads up. And the HOA actually wrote back, and we actually now have two different drafts, a draft and then the one that was actually sent letters of the HOA back to them. And one of the letters basically said, look, we've got all kinds of people in this HOA and some people who don't believe like you do in the religious aspects of Christmas. And frankly, we don't want all these people that disagree with us religiously or otherwise coming into this neighborhood to look at your lights. We don't want and this is the quote, the riffraff from Walmart coming into our neighborhood at Christmas time. And so, things didn't get off to the best foot, maybe, moving into that HOA. Well, then they noticed when Halloween came around, guess what? All kinds of lights were up, decorations for Halloween, witches and ghosts and all the goblins that go along with, what your neighborhood looks like right now with those gaudy blow-up purple and orange things that are out there. And so they're like, well, wait a minute, this doesn't seem right. And so they pressed ahead with their plan anyway. And they decided to try to mitigate as much as possible the footprint that they would have there. So they still have the lights on and all that. But they actually worked with the city to have a parking set up at a local park about a mile away. They paid for buses to drive them from the parking area quickly through the community. They would stop at the driveway and people would step off of the bus and onto their driveway, stay there for a few minutes, get some hot chocolate, hear the gospel presentation. There was a little cotton candy and other candies that were given away to the kids and all that. And just a chance for them to I think there was one night where they sung Christmas carols as well, but pretty quietly. So there was no like loud amplification going on. Not a microphone was used. There was no speakers put in the windows or anything like that for the noise to be carrying on through the neighborhood. People would spend maybe 15 minutes on the property. The next bus would come in and they'd get on when another group came in. Well, this dispute continued to escalate and more. And finally, Jeremy decided he'd had enough and he filed a lawsuit alleging religious discrimination in housing. And lo and behold, and frankly, I think Kelly will agree with this, I was frankly surprised that a jury actually agreed with Jeremy. This is a pretty high cotton to knock down. And he actually got a jury verdict to agree with him that this was, in fact, religious discrimination in housing. And he was all excited. And then the judge took it away from the jury, overruled the jury's decision, and inserted his own determination. And that flipped the script entirely. Not only did he have a jury verdict before, but he had been awarded $75,000 in damages against the HOA. And so when the judge overruled that, the money flipped around. So instead of getting $75,000, he was now on the hook for over $150,000 of their fees on the other side. And so we've come in here because Christy said it, I think, the best. She said, I've had to go to court to invite people over to my house for Christmas. That's a big deal. When you are so excited about sharing the gospel with people, celebrating the season that is very central to your faith, and you actually get the HOA to say that one of the reasons why they're opposed to you is because of your religious practices involved in this. It's going to hurt personally, but when then you have the jury give you the win and then whoop, it's just pulled out from underneath of you like that by a judge who should respect the decision of a jury here, or else our entire system of government is completely thrown off. Well, that's a hard pill to swallow. So we're asking the Ninth Circuit something I think very simple: just reinstate the jury's verdict and let it be at that.
Most of the debate over these kinds of things are typically Christmas decorations on public land, right?
Yeah, this is in your own house now, right? Exactly. This isn't like a nativity set or menorah or something like that on the town square. You're right. So it used to be that they would say, well, look, if you want to have a Christmas display, then go set it up at your own house. And now they did.
That's what they did.
And they still can't get any relief from it.
And they were not only doing a Christmas display, they were raising money for charity as well. And so. No good deed goes unpunished, right?
Yeah, there's the one thing I forgot. They'd have a little box set aside. You could put some money in if you wanted. There was no choice. He bought he paid for the hot chocolate and for the electrical bill that was running the 10,000 watts he could see from space. But it was you're right. People would come in just to dump $1 or $2 or $20 in there, and homeless kids that were abused. They're now losing out on the several $1,000s, frankly, that they would give to the children every year.
And you said this is at the Ninth Circuit, right? Which is typically the most liberal in the country. Is that right?
Yeah, we're not afraid of people that are more liberal than us. We're happy to go and convince them of how right this position is, too.
Does a circuit court look at something like this and then look at the makeup of the Supreme Court and say, we see the tide is turned in the Supreme Court, and therefore... maybe if we had 5 or 6 liberals on the Supreme Court, we would go ahead and challenge this, but what's the point? And they just go ahead and decide to reverse this and go with the initial decision. Does a circuit court look at the Supreme Court and say, we know where our what we would normally do is not going to pass, so let's just go ahead and say this?
The Ninth Circuit is the most overturned circuit in the country by far. Somewhere closing in on 80% of their cases that are taken are reversed. So I don't think they care much about that. I do think that this is one of those cases where, liberals would be concerned. If the jury verdict can be thrown out and judges take over everything, I don't know that that's what they want. They like the idea of the citizen having a right to access to the courts and for juries to make decisions. So we'll have to see on that, on what they do. But I think most people who are more liberal, for the little guy, that's sort of their mantra or whatever. This is their case. This is the little guy. This is it went in, had a jury. The jury said this is wrong. So we'll see. I'm hopeful, at least in this case, they'll get it right.
Did the judge give a reason because sometimes you might say the jury's done this or they've taken this and they've overemphasized this or that. Did the judge give any reason, or did he just say you're wrong?
No, he did, and that's kind of the disturbing part of it. So, and to answer the question, I have to tell you, kind of remind you what a jury does. The jury's responsibility is to weigh the evidence presented to them and decide issues of fact. Right. That includes making determinations upon the credibility of various witnesses as well as the credibility of the evidence presented in front of them.
And sometimes the judge gives directions that the jury says, I would go this way, but the judge has told us we have to consider it this way or that way, and so that we've got to move with that direction.
That's right. And not only that, but how you're supposed to weigh the evidence, and how you're supposed to deliberate and all that. And then he answers questions even while they're deliberating about how they're supposed to weigh the evidence and all that. And so that's exactly what the jury did. They weighed all the witnesses that were up there and determined which ones were more credible presented to them than the other ones. Well, what the judge said is basically, let me back up. So there was a motion before the trial even that showed this letter to the trial, and they were trying to kill the trial entirely, and the other side was saying this is not even necessary. You should decide this on a matter of law, Judge. And the judge said, no, if only because of that letter there's enough for a reasonable jury to make a determination here of discrimination in housing. And so they go to trial, they present all the evidence, and the judge comes back and says, well, after all, no reasonable jury could have actually made a reasonable decision here. So-and-so is not credible, the evidence wasn't enough. And he goes down the list and kind of criticizes everything that the jury actually has the responsibility for in finding. And it's also very remarkable and just this last thing, the jury deliberated. It wasn't like they went in and came out. They deliberated for 17 hours on this evidence. And the judge kind of pushes that away and says, well, you shouldn't have made that decision anyway. So it's a very egregious case and one that we hope the Ninth Circuit will rectify.
1-800-351-1212 if you'd like to weigh in on issues of the week, 1-800-351-1212. When we come back, we'll catch up on a few other issues that are happening at the national level and some of the things with impeachment and just what's going on with this thing. So stay with us. We'll be back in just a minute.
There's an old saying that the first casualty in war is truth. Maybe that helps you understand what's happening in America right now. Thankfully, it's not a war with bullets, but there is a war for control. Control of the country and control of your pocketbook. Truth is under fire, but you can help turn the tide by supporting Truth. Join the Truth Team at Point of View Radio. Learn how you can make a difference at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Don't let truth become a casualty on your watch. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
So what would you do with an extra $500 a month in your budget? Pay off loans, save it, do something fun? Well, it's something you may need to think about if you become a member of MediShare. MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. You can save big time on your healthcare costs, and you don't have to pay for things you don't believe in either. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40. 855-SHARE-40.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back. Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson, and with me in studio, Kelly Shackelford and Jeremy Dys from the First Liberty Institute. We've been talking a little bit about religious liberty, but we were also talking earlier about some of the things the president is up to and the impeachment process. Gentlemen, the president was in Dallas yesterday giving his campaign rally, packed crowd. Beto O'Rourke had a counter rally, didn't get as big a crowd, but my understanding is from the news it was still a fairly good crowd for him.
People were there giving away their guns.
I think they were giving away their guns.
Did he stop at Buc-ee's to get more campaign consultation from people in the bathrooms there? Or?
I'm not sure, but the amazing thing here, people were camping out on the streets 2 and 3 days, I think, before the speech started, and the news was here covering some of them and saying, well, yeah, we've got some tents here and we're camping out and we're finding ways to make do because we want to get in. It is amazing how popular the president is with certain populations out there. 1-800-351-1212 if you'd like to weigh in on this, 1-800-351-1212. But Kelly, you just don't see this anywhere else. It's one of the amazing things about this particular president.
No, it's, I took last night as a very bad sign for the Democrats. 50,000 people, 30,000 outside. Mm-hmm. I mean, waiting in the cool weather to watch, and the energy was just, they tried to say this last time during the election. Oh, these don't mean anything. There's such a small number of people compared to the electorate. It says a lot about the energy, I think energy is much more important than, the sort of old theory in politics is, well, you go to the middle because you need those people in the middle. And I've always thought that's really wrong. It's all about who has the energy, because who is going to go and walk and stuff envelopes and invite their friends to vote. And, it's the people that are more passionate, that are more, and I think clearly at this point the passion is I think on the president's side, and I think many people believe, especially because of the Democrat is such a mess, the candidates, and nobody's really thrilled about any of the leaders, that I think that's why the impeachment thing, these attempts have been going, because I don't think they feel very confident in their candidates, and so we have this process where, again, I don't know that they're really even at your impeachment because they know they can't get a conviction in the Senate. Mm-hmm. I think they just want to bloody him, sort of leak these negative things each day and from their, secret hearings and everything else. And I think that's why they're doing it, because I think they worry that they're going to get trounced if something doesn't happen.
And this was from the beginning. Sometimes you have a Barack Obama. He had small crowds at first as a candidate, and then they started building, and then he had very excited crowds later on. But Steve Moore, I think you may know him. He's a friend of mine, but he told me a few years ago, he said he was sent to a Jeb Bush rally. This was before the election, when Jeb was still in there, and there was dozens of people in the room, and Jeb was in talking, and you getting this sort of little light applause and so forth. And he said then he went over to a Trump rally. And this is in the early days of the campaign, and he said the place was packed. People were yelling and screaming, and he said I looked at this, and because Steve's been in politics for a long time, he said this is the first time I've ever seen that. Something was happening with Donald Trump, like him or hate him. Something was happening with him, that he was connecting with people in ways that they had never seen before. And I don't think any of the Democrats get that kind of return right now.
No. Look, you said something about impeachment, Kelly, and that may end up proving to backfire badly for their best candidate, or at least who they thought was going to be the front runner. Mm-hmm. You've seen Joe Biden steadily drop in the polls from 1 to, I think he's down to 3 in most of the averages right now, the polls. This whole thing with, you want to talk about quid pro quo? Well, let's talk about Hunter Biden, right? You can't talk about impeachment anywhere without having damage done to Joe Biden. So it's going to backfire at them. But to your broader point, buddy, that the energy in the room, Well, are you excited for a guy that just came out of a heart attack? I mean, are you excited about a guy who wants to have $120 trillion to be able to do his entire plan and raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour and mandate that you take that job and not any other one? I mean, are you that excited about Elizabeth Warren and her, although she's got energy in terms of being able to, it seems like she jogs everywhere she goes, but are you that excited about the fact that she's 1/10/24th part American Indian and was apparently fired from her job, except that she wasn't, for being pregnant? You know, I mean, are you that jazzed about that person who won't tell you about how she's actually going to tax the middle class and won't actually call it a tax, and even though you know she is trying to convince you that she's not going to actually do that? And go on down the list. Are you excited about Beto O'Rourke? And although he's got kind of a fun way of presenting himself with his flappy arms, I mean, goodness gracious, is this a guy that you really want leading your country that says, give me all your guns? And, oh, by the way, the mass murderers, yeah, they'll be the first ones in line to volunteer to give you their AR-15s away. Do you think that he's the right guy to say, yeah, I'm going to be the president, and then, every church and mosque and synagogue in the country is going to lose their tax exemption because you don't agree, if you don't agree with the way I believe you ought to agree? I mean, go on and on and on down through the list of people like Kamala Harris who laugh at her own jokes when nobody else does. Cory Booker, who seems like always wants to be yelling at you wherever he goes, and it seems about ready to fight you. You know, I mean, goodness gracious, there's nobody on the other side here that seems to be even likable, let alone electable on these issues here. They're certainly not presenting a vision for the country that is robustly free. It is saying, no, we know better than you do how to spend your money, live your life, and do everything else, so just let the professionals handle it. Americans don't want that.
Kelly mentioned that typically you get the nomination, then you move back to the center. But if Elizabeth Warren gets the nomination, and certainly Bernie Sanders, which I don't think is likely, but if that happens, I don't think they're going to move back to the center. You know, you brought up Hunter Biden. So the Washington Post has an article out. A career State Department official overseeing Ukraine policy told congressional investigators this week that he had raised concerns in early 2015 about then Vice President Joe Biden's son serving on the board of a Ukrainian energy company, but was turned away by a Biden staffer. Name was George Kent, a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, testified Tuesday that he worried that Hunter Biden's position at the firm Burisma Holdings would complicate efforts by U.S. diplomats to convey to Ukrainian officials the importance of avoiding conflicts of interest. So it's interesting the Washington Post is reporting this because for some time I've been looking at this saying, anytime a business owner or CEO does something and you think there's some money there, you come up and say, follow the money. And here's Hunter Biden is on the board of a company in Ukraine that he has no basic experience in, and yet the media have just said, well, we've looked at that and there was nothing there. $50,000 a month, and he has no experience in that.
And see, here's the thing. Most of the average voter right now, I'm convinced of this, says, yeah, okay, fine, maybe there's corruption there. I don't know. I can't figure all that out. He's making $50,000 a month sitting on a board, right? I mean, most Americans, that's the median income, right? That's what
absolutely
the average income is per year, not per month.
And how did he get the job? He was kicked out of the service, okay? He was kicked out of the military because of drugs. So he was booted out. Within weeks, he gets a job when he has no Ukrainian experience, no oil and gas experience, and all of a sudden he's on the board making $50,000 a month. I mean, that's...
What he did have was a father who was vice president of the United States and who was the administration's point man for Ukraine policy.
That's right.
And so the connections there are just, any rational person would say maybe there's nothing there, but it certainly looks like there's something here.
And let me throw out a challenge to people that are listening to the leaks and the media stuff with regard to President Trump. And you know, because the polls are like, people are like, oh yeah, we should have the impeachment occur. We should remove him from office. Some people are saying that, which is just crazy because we don't know anything. But I would just challenge you, read the transcript of the phone discussion. That's what this is all about. Read the transcript of the phone discussion between President Trump and the president of Ukraine. Anybody who's fair-minded who reads that goes, they want to impeach him over what? Because he didn't, you know, it's obvious what's going on there. And so that one is the one they're trying to impeach over. Meanwhile, Biden, you've got real issues. And so it's so bizarre that they're arguing the same kind of thing. But in Trump's case, it's clearly he's like, hey, if there's any of that, I know there's been a lot of corruption. Let's figure out if there was corruption that affected our election 2 years ago. That's not a problem. Getting $50,000 a month from for your son, and then saying you're going to hold up money because of the company, the investigation of the company he's a board member of. That's obviously a lot more problematic.
Well, when we come back, let's talk a little bit about Joe Biden. He made a statement at the debate on Tuesday in Houston, and we'll come take a look at that and see if that, in fact, has some validity to it. Stay with us, and we'll be back.
A consequential anniversary just passed. It has been 50 years since the nation's first no-fault divorce law was enacted. No-fault divorce laws make it so one partner can end a marriage simply by citing irreconcilable differences. Governor Ronald Reagan signed California's no-fault divorce bill in 1969. 44 states followed suit. Reagan later told his son Michael that this action, which unleashed a revolution, was his greatest regret. The intent of no-fault divorce was to reduce the false accusations that characterized divorce proceedings. To fulfill the legal requirement that a judge find fault in one spouse, the parties would often concoct phony allegations against one another. Sometimes they'd even conspire to lie to a judge. Lawmakers thought it better to lower barriers to divorce than to allow what many called institutionalized perjury to continue. The Daily Signal's Daniel Davis wrote that among the devastating consequences of no-fault divorce is our throwaway culture. He observed that, quote, 50 years later, the perverse incentive to commit perjury seems utterly minuscule when compared with the wreckage that came from the divorce revolution. The divorce rate shot up. Roughly half of children born to married couples in the 1970s saw their parents divorce, up from 11% of those born in the 50s. The rate is lower today, but marriage is also down. The redefinition of marriage has been devastating. It began, Mr. Davis explains, not with same-sex marriage, but with no-fault divorce. No-fault divorce, he writes, essentially made void the contract of marriage. Either party could now break their marriage vows and cite irreconcilable differences to get a divorce. Previously, a transcendent vision of marriage formed the basis of its legal recognition, placing marriage beyond the reach of any human whim. There's something in humans that still craves the transcendence and permanence Daniel Davis describes. There's a solution, he says. It's what the Bible calls covenant faithfulness. We should restore marriage till death do us part. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to our last segment of Point of View and our weekend review today. We were talking about Joe Biden and mentioned the debates that were going on, and the issue came up about his son. And Joe Biden said, I would never do something like that. I would never discuss something like that with my son, who is on the board of a company that had some let's say, dodgy relationships and so forth. But we found a picture of him, what was it, about 2014 or so, where he's at the golf course.
That's right.
With his son's partner, and the CEO of Burisma. And and you said you're playing golf and you didn't discuss anything there?
Yeah, it's I think everybody look. The American people are smart enough to know. I mean, Hunter Biden got the job a few days after being booted out of the military, not because he had any experience, not because he could even speak, to people in the Ukraine, not because he had oil and gas experience. Just like he didn't get the $1.6 billion of investment from China because he had some expertise there. Mm-hmm. This is all because this is my father is the vice president. And whether, again, people can try to get into the semantics of what's legal or not. That's just, people know that's just wrong. That's not the kind of people you want leading your country, that they're going to take advantage of their position to, throw, that. And by the way, when that happens, that affects your decision making. Mm-hmm. Everybody knows that. You're giving my son what?
Yep.
So people know that. Every American knows that, and they're well aware of that. And so that's why I if I give people 2 homework assignments for the weekend, the longer one would be reading the Attorney General Barr speech, mm-hmm. because that's a little longer, but it's still I think it's one of the best speeches, and for any believer, I think it's excellent for them to understand really the basis of our country, how your faith comes into that, why that's so important in a free society.
And you can't just watch it if you have an aversion to reading.
That's right. Just watch the speech.
You can. I mean, if the producer knows, he just prefers to look at pictures rather than reading things. So,
but the second assignment would be, and this is a lot simpler. This will take you almost no time. Is I dare you, if you haven't read it, read the transcript of the president's phone discussion with the president of the Ukraine, mm-hmm. and see if, oh yeah, that's a high crime and misdemeanor right there. You're going to go, and again, but that way from now on, you can say, when everybody else gives their opinion, you say, have you read the transcript? Well, then you don't need to be talking about this. I've read it. But you're going to realize how crazy all this stuff is that's going on, and how completely out of control.
The what Hunter Biden did, as you say, probably not anything illegal there, but it's the definition of the swamp.
Yes,
and that's what Donald Trump came in. I don't think he's been as effective as I'd like to see him in draining the swamp. But that's the swamp where you have people who have connections and power and so forth, and you play off that power. Joe Biden's brother, I think, was doing something similar mm-hmm. here recently. And so you're saying that the person called Joe Biden, his brother called him and said, hey, I got something to mention to you. Joe Biden would say, oh, no, I can't talk to you about that. That's just not what Joe Biden would do.
Yeah, people wonder, I mean, a lot of people, especially on the, we're on Christian stations all the time, people wonder, how can these people be so excited about Trump? He's obviously got character issues and all these kinds of things. I think it's pretty clear. It's because what's been happening in D.C. has been an inside game. They don't accomplish anything. They rip all the rest of the country off. Nobody was willing to overturn a table mm-hmm. until Trump. And here's a person who says, I don't care what you think. I'm going to throw the tables over. I'm gonna make all the insiders upset, because I'm gonna actually be here for the American people, and I'm gonna fight for things that nobody else is willing to fight for. And people feel like, oh my gosh, somebody is, and along with that, President Trump actually believes in sort of the traditional, apple pie, American flag. I mean, you would never see him, like Barack Obama, refusing to wear a lapel pin of the flag, mm-hmm. right? He believes in those traditions, those kinds of things. He does those things all the time. Whereas on the other side, you got people who want to change the country. They want to change it from. And so I get a lot of people, if you looked at what a lot of them said when they were asked by reporters, they would say things like, when I saw the motorcade go by, that's one of the most memorable. And it's not because of Trump. It's because all Americans used to do that. Mm-hmm. They used to see the motorcade, the motorcycles, and think the President of the United States. And there's that tradition, that sort of, I don't know what you call it, patriotism, right? That is on the Trump side, but the other side is sort of wanting a different system. They want to break, Elizabeth Warren wants to break up the economy and redo it. And so I think
large corporate boards.
Yeah. And so that's, I think, if people want to understand a little bit, it's that American pie, patriotism and fighting against the insider DC crowd, whatever it takes. why people are so excited, and you got those huge rallies.
You remember at one of the NATO meetings where Trump went and gave Germany a hard time on buying gas from Russia, but also about paying more for their own self-defense. And the press gave him a bit of a hard time for doing that. And I was talking to Ari Fleischer, used to be George W. Bush's press secretary, sometime later, and I asked him about that, and he said, he said when Bush would go to the NATO meetings, he would say, you need to pay more for your own defense, so we're not carrying so much of the load. And they would all say, yes, we'll do that, and then they never did anything. He said he sort of supported Trump doing that because of the traditional thing of, in diplomacy, we don't shake things up, we don't ruffle feathers, we treat everybody nice, and Trump doesn't do that. He comes in and he does ruffle feathers a good bit. And Ari thought that was exactly what you need to do, because otherwise nothing changes.
Yeah, and look, in terms of this nepotism problem with Biden getting his thing, there is a problem on both sides here, and we should not be tolerant of that. We don't send people to Washington, D.C. to become millionaires. You'll notice that even Bernie Sanders has changed his line, right? It's not no one should be a millionaire now. It should be no one should be a billionaire now. He's had to change it because he are one. He's a millionaire himself now.
Hey, it costs money to run those 3 houses that he owns.
I suppose so, but he's done that through what career? What business has he created? What jobs has he produced? No, he's done that through being a senator from the state of New Hampshire. I mean, so goodness,
or maybe Vermont.
Vermont. I'm so sorry. Yeah, they're all up there. The small ones up there. I apologize to the states of New Hampshire and Vermont assiduously here. But look, that's the point. Look, when you get to D.C., something becomes the ability to make money through the civic or the civil servant process is not right, and we need to stop that. That's what we sent Trump there. Many people sent Trump there to do. There is a concern, and I think somewhat justifiable, that perhaps he's getting himself a little bit too swampy at times while he's trying to find the drain to the swamp in D.C.
It's going to be hard draining that swamp. It's been there a long time.
It has, but if you ever wondered, is anybody trying to do it? It's obvious it's Trump, because, I mean, whistleblowers are really just, deep state people trying to go after the president. All these things, it's obvious that people that are embedded within the government hate Trump and they want to get rid of him, which, is somewhat of a, sort of proof point for all the people who wanted somebody to go in there and mess everything up and get the country back in the hands of the people. So obviously he's doing something, because he's being attacked I've never seen anything like anybody being attacked.
I don't think anybody has, yes.
I mean, day one, we want to impeach the president, and they've been trying to find a new reason every other day. It never ends.
Kelly Shackelford and Jeremy Dys from the First Liberty Institute, thank you for joining us today. You can go to First Liberty Institute and see all the great information that's available there. You can also go to IPI, Institute for Policy Innovation, IPI.org, and find the information that we publish there. I want to thank Steve and Andrew for manning the controls and the phones and so forth, and we appreciate that. Been an interesting day. We've got another big week coming up next week, I suspect. So thank you for joining us on Point of View.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dys would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kirby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kirby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.